I finished the entire 50 Shades trilogy. I have read every Twilight novel twice. I made it through 3 MAGA hat romances, but this book I couldn't finish. And it's got my name on it. Sponsored by Bright Cellars. Hello my beautiful watchers. I think the title of this one is pretty self-explanatory. Today I'm rating erotic novels that bear my name in the title. The reason I'm drinking will become self-explanatory too in a little bit. But why, Dom, you may be asking? Well, because when the SAG strike ended, I said unto my beloved patrons that I had started this film-avoidy content script, but it was not too late for me to pivot back to Lost in Adaptation if they so desired. However, when they found out exactly what I was working on, they voted for me to continue. Probably because they always pick the option most likely to result in my suffering. I still appreciate you guys though. In fact, everyone should become my patron. I post exclusive content there every month. The suffering isn't because I'm sex negative, by the way. I don't do an OnlyFans page for charity because I'm prudish. It's just that I seem to have an extremely poor track record for finding good erotic fiction and usually end up with something mind-bogglingly weird. Anyways, I've decided to judge this Dominic smut based on 3 things: the overall Dominic story, the Dominic sex scenes, and how much I liked each Dominic. What criteria will I be using to judge the sex scenes, you ask? Don't worry about it. And just so it's not confusing at all, I'm going to be judging them on a scale of 1 to 10 Dominics. Interestingly, it turned out that 100% of the novels called Dominic that I could find were part of a long-running anthology series that all bore somebody's name. So my first conclusion is someone needs to write a standalone Dominic erotica, you cowards. Oh, and a couple of addendums before we get started. Firstly, keep in mind that I am not really the target audience for these sorts of novels. They're usually written to appeal to the young adult female crowd, and I am a tired elder millennial man. So while I'm not going to be holding back on sharing my honest opinion, it should not be considered the byword for these books' overall value.
I didn't make them for you!
And secondly, please be aware that themes of non-consent and sometimes extreme violence will be discussed in this video. It appears that roughly half of fictional Dominics have serious problems when it comes to taking no for an answer. Depending on the book, these things will either be presented as traumatizing events in someone's backstory, or as a full-on kink, so if either of those things disturb you, you might want to give this one a miss. We shall begin with Dominic Cerberus MC by Marie James, book 4 of a 20-part series based around members of a motorcycle club called Cerberus, each finding love in unexpected places. This series also includes a Christmas short story, which, quite honestly, I kind of love. I mean, look at this, it's adorable. As the setup might suggest, this particular Dominic is a 37-year-old, super macho, alpha male, testosterone-dripping ex-Marine Chad who benches 300 pounds for 2 hours every day. In the prologue, when he's a 20-something-year-old Dominic on home from leave, he catches his high school sweetheart turned wife cheating on him.
My wife bent over in the shower getting fucked by the next-door neighbor, a man I considered a friend who I asked to keep an eye on Karen while I was away. For the briefest of seconds, I realized how disappointed in her I am, not only for cheating and ripping my heart out, but because she didn't choose another Marine to do it with. I have to remind myself that hitting a woman is something I'd never do, as my brain tries to reason that sometimes a bitch just needs to be smacked.
Stop, Dominic, I can explain.
Ignoring her pleas, I walk out of the house and away from her. At the threshold, I leave any and all emotion that could hurt me this bad again. 1 year left in the Marines turns into 17 as I keep my vow never to trust a woman again.
So, obviously the plot is about him learning to trust a woman again. I must confess this book was a bit surprising to me at first because the uber macho nature of the male lead seemed way more like a male power fantasy than the kind of love interest you would usually find in a novel by a woman for women. But by the end of the book, Dominic has realized the error of his ways and learned to be a super sensitive, gentle and caring man, so it's more of a she can fix him thing than a isn't toxic masculinity great affair. The she in question is Michaela, the sister of a rival biker gang leader who goes on the run to escape one of the group's senior members who's been sexually assaulting her since she was a teenager. From what I've gathered from this book, Cerberus is a pretty heroic biker gang, roving around protecting the innocent, doing community outreach, and fighting evildoers, so she comes to known member Dominic for protection. 90% of the story takes place inside of Dom's house as he grudgingly allows her to hide out there and they slowly fall for each other. The sex part of the book is big into the domination submissive setup. There's elements of sadomasochism, but it's more about her relinquishing complete control to him in the bedroom. There is not a single joke about his name in relation to this, by the way, possibly because, like me, he had already heard it 1,000 times by the time he was in his mid-20s and was a tad tired of it. The ending was a little underwhelming, as after a huge build-up getting Cerberus on board for a confrontation with the bad biker gang, who it's revealed is also making underage pornography on the side as well as assaulting its female members, the conflict itself is over super quickly and decisively. It takes about a paragraph and very little effort on the part of the protagonist to completely wipe out the evildoers. The story ends on what I've noticed is a pretty common event in romance novels: the love interest married and ecstatic to have a kid on the way, after a relationship that can be measured in the months, if not the weeks. As someone who's child-free by choice, and I suspect was just born without that part of the brain that causes even the smallest paternal feelings, I've always found that kind of ending to be genuinely horrifying, but I do understand in principle that it has appeal for others. Now, unfortunately, I could not help but notice that the plot was pretty similar to the setup of The Mister, though with a hyper-masculine biker as the traumatized woman's protector instead of a spoiled rich yuppie. However, like most comparisons to E.L. James, that is doing this author a bit of a disservice. Marie James is a much better writer than the Snow Queen Ice Dragon. She doesn't over-explain every action a character takes, and she displays a clear understanding of BDSM. Crucially, the importance of aftercare and what damage its absence can cause, and the extreme necessity that all parties be enthusiastic as hell about their role in it. What's more, the abuser in the story is the bad guy, not the guy you're supposed to fantasize about. Speaking of which, for whatever it's worth coming from someone who's not experienced sexual assault directly, but is close to multiple people who have, I personally thought the book's exploration of how some survivors might reclaim some power over their lives through intense sexuality and kink to be pretty realistic and respectful. It isn't fetishized, judged, or presented as a magical cure, so, respect to James for that. So yes, this book may use a lot of the same tropes as The Mister, but it is infinitely better. It's not, an amazing novel, but I will take this James over the other any day. Yet another reminder of the extreme injustice that, with all these better options out there, 50 Shades of Grey is still the go-to kink book of our era. Random, but there's this funny bit at the end when Michaela is planning on moving on with her life, but her baby sister turned adopted daughter has clearly taken a bit of a shine to Dominic and doesn't want to leave his house, and it made me realize that someone's child low-key bullying them into getting with a guy they like is something I've seen quite a lot in romance books and movies. Question for all the single parents out there: is this a real thing? Does that actually happen in real life? Like, not a kid making you feel obligated to stay with someone, them inadvertently pressuring you to get with someone they like. I just have to know. So, all in all, I'm going to give Dominic by Marie James a 4 out of 10 for the overall story due to its limited scope and anticlimactic ending. A 7 out of 10 Dominics for sex scenes though, because of James's refreshing grasp of the DS part of BDSM and her not dragging them out for an entire bloody chapter while the plot grinds to a halt. And her Dominic gets a score of 6 Dominics out of 10 Dominics, because while he had a decent character arc, I couldn't personally relate to the toxic alpha male or proud father versions of him. Moving on to Dominic, a dark mafia romance by Natasha Knight. Published in 2016, this is book 2 of 5 of what is apparently the most successful series on today's roster, having sold over 1 million books that have been translated into 6 languages and made it onto USA Today's bestsellers list. Okay, so I know I already gave a trigger warning, but this is by far the most graphic of the bunch. It is by design a dark kink fantasy that is heavy into the violent non-consent, so if you'd rather skip it and go back to hearing about somewhat less extreme Dominics, then here's the timecode. Before we get to the grim stuff though, I do have a funny story. Despite the age-old adage, I completely misjudged this book from looking at its cover. I read a dark mafia romance and thought, aha! A dark mafia, you say? Like a magic mafia for evil sorcerers doing the dark arts. Color me interested. But no, it's a dark mafia romance, a dark story involving the regular mafia. I felt a little silly, but in my defense, look at this motherfucker and tell me he doesn't look like a magician. If you saw him on a poster in Las Vegas, you'd be like, yeah, looks legit. But unfortunately, no, he's not a wizard. He's a rapist. Dominic number 2 is Dominic Benedetti, the son of a mafia crime king who, due to a series of betrayals and murders, has fled the family and is now working as a freelance human trafficker, brainwashing and breaking the spirits of recently kidnapped young women before they're sold at auction. He's basically one of the people that Liam Neeson was shooting in the face all through Taken. You can probably guess that this is not going to be my favourite Dominic. That said, I would like to make it clear that I'm not judging Knight or anyone who might have enjoyed this book. The non-consent kink in fiction is only really a problem when it somehow finds itself outside of the safe space that people have mutually agreed to explore it in an informed manner. When, say, the author is oblivious to the fact that she's writing about it and tries to pass it off as genuine romance, or if someone is attempting to use it to normalize the behavior in real life, or just sharing it around publicly without a proper warning like Belle Delphine. And none of that really applies here. Once you're past the magician on the cover, the book's description is pretty clear on what it is, and Knight does not attempt to soften or excuse Dark Mafia Dominic's behavior. In fact, his utter irredeemability is kind of his whole thing. The other way that you can tell that this is heavy kink by design is the other main character who's on the receiving end of his mistreatments is, despite her better judgment, really into it. This is a book that is very aware that it's a story about a fucked up relationship involving an utter villain, and it is not pretending to be anything else. So, in the first chapter, Dark Dominic is sent the story's other POV character, a girl called Gia, to get the slave training treatment, but she's way more resistant to his attempts than most people. Gia, who's got a whole troubled backstory of her own, intends to resist his torture and turn Dominic into her ally using seduction and manipulation. However, this battle of wits doesn't last long into the book, as Dominic quickly realizes that Gia has mob ties of her own and has access to information that might help him get revenge on the people who killed both his brother and her father, so they sort of team up, but not as equals, in a way where she is still his prisoner and sex slave. A big theme of the book is both characters dealing with their self-loathing and guilt. Dominic because he knows he's a piece of shit monster, and Gia because she's ashamed of how much she really enjoys getting sexually assaulted and wants him to keep doing it. Funnily enough, when the book stops being about kink and the plot gets going, things get convoluted fast, perfectly encapsulated by this one excerpt.
I turned and walked the length of the room, running both hands through my hair, trying to make sense of what I just learned. That my uncle had hired the man who had fathered me to kill my half-brother.
And to make matters worse, my nephew paid my second cousin to beat up my grandmother's stepsister, so Thanksgiving is going to be really awkward this year. Knight tries to draw the reader in with a series of plot twists and reveals regarding who was related to who and who betrayed who in Dom and Gia's past, but she honestly hadn't really succeeded in making me give a damn about this extended crime family beforehand, so I was struggling to care. Dominic eventually gets the top spot in his mafia, and it plays out kind of like the end of The Godfather, where Michael Corleone was killing off all his rivals and opponents and going full dark side, but I mean, Dom had been a pretty consistent asshat all the way through, so it felt like less of an absolute power truly reveals as just business as usual. There's a slight twist on the third act breakup trope when Gia says no to dating Dominic a few months after he finally released her and they parted ways. Dominic is pretty bummed out until he remembers that their entire relationship was based on ignoring what she wanted, so he simply takes her back by force, which she's pretty into, so together they live non-consensually ever after. So while this book had its flaws regarding keeping me interested, it at least had a significant amount going on and actual stakes, so I'm going to give it a generous 6 Dominics for story. For what they are, the sex scenes seem to be at least pretty well written. If this particular kink is your jam, I think you would enjoy reading them, so 5 Dominics for effort. However, Dark Dominic gets a meager 2 out of 10 Dominics for failing to be more than an R-rated ripoff of The Godfather. After such a low score, it might come as a big surprise to you to hear that Dark Dominic was not in fact my least favorite Dominic. Yeah. But first, a quick word about this video's sponsor. As the great Gene Wilder once said in a vastly underrated movie,
Why don't we all drink some very sexy wine?
wine. It's not just good for helping you get through terrible books with your sanity intact, it's the perfect pairing for certain meals, delightful nights with friends and loved ones, and swirling in a glass while you explain your evil plan to your nemesis. I have finally reached the point in life where I've developed sufficient palate and self-respect to no longer wish to pick my wines based entirely on if there's a cool horse on the label, but I have very little experience figuring out what's right for me any other way. Bright Sellers to the rescue. After a quick and easy 7-question quiz, they matched me me with a selection of wines from all around the world. They were delivered right to my door, and each bottle came with an education card that outlined tasting notes, suggested pairings, best serving temperatures, and origins, so I would be able to enjoy each of them to the fullest and have a much better idea of what I'm looking for in the future. Bright Cellars was so confident they could predict my preferences, they offered to replace any bottle I didn't enjoy with my next order. And you can get in on this action, because Bright Cellars is offering my beautiful watchers 35% off all of their wine bundles up until the 27th of November. If you're interested, click the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen to save on bundles of 4 to 12 bottles of wine delivered straight to your door. So, fun story, off camera I just dropped and shattered what turned out to be my only normal wine glass. Yeah, I owned one wine glass. That is how single I am right now. Anyway, that's why I'm drinking from a goblet from here on. Dominic, a Slater Brothers novel, is the first of 6 novels by Irish author L.A. Casey, published in 2014. If I'm understanding things correctly, it was originally a self-published series that's since been picked up by traditional publishing groups. This may sound stupid, but I actually felt genuine trepidation sharing my thoughts on this book because, I mean, history does not need another example of the British shitting on the Irish, but I can't hold my peace on this one. My beautiful watchers, this is one of the very, very few occasions in my nearly 10-year career as a guy pretending to be insightful on the internet where I could not, no matter how hard I tried, finish a book. I think I got about halfway through. I finished the entire 50 Shades trilogy. I have read every Twilight novel twice. I made it through 3 MAGA hat romances, but this book I couldn't finish. And it's got my name on it. And I tried, I swear I tried. I pride myself on being a professional, and there's obvious ethical problems with me sharing an opinion on something I haven't fully experienced, but I just cannot overstate how much brighter my world seemed every time I stopped reading this book. And just this once, I chose joy. Here's what I got before I threw in the towel. Dominic Slater is an 18-year-old American student and secret underground cage fighter whose family just relocated to Ireland for his last year of school. Unique amongst all Dominics so far, he isn't a POV character in this book. That honour exclusively goes to 17-year-old Brona Murphy, a young Irish lass who's apparently the mortal woman most hated and cursed by all the gods. Never has there been a more unfairly treated, unlucky girl in all of Ireland. In between being forced into a never-ending series of events and tasks that she does not enjoy, she regularly gets beaten up by bullies who face no consequences, but she's severely punished if she's ever caught defending herself, no matter how passively, and if other people fight over her, she's usually hurt in the crossfire and then punished for instigating it. While this is a pretty extreme example of it, I've actually seen this sort of thing quite a lot in books aimed at a younger audience. Your boy is old as fuck, but even I remember the universal teenage experience of resenting an unjust and uncaring world that was absolutely out to get me in particular, so it's a pretty low-hanging fruit option for an author to elicit an emotional response from the reader by tapping into and validating that sentiment by writing about a world that really is as unfair as it sometimes felt. FYI, you absolutely have to read this book with an Irish accent because it's written in Brona's South Dublin dialect, so me will occasionally replace my in certain sentences, so if you don't imagine the accent, she sounds a bit like a cave woman. While my single biggest issue with this book is how much I loathed its Dominic, that is not the only reason I failed in my quest to read it. Brona is introduced as a character with the most cliche in all of romantic fiction, with her frowning at her reflection in the mirror. I actually let out an audible groan when that popped up on the first page. This was immediately followed by the most gratuitous use of complaint bragging I have ever come across in fiction.
Standing in the senior girl's bathroom in front of a mirror, I frowned at my appearance. My eyes of jade looked tired. I didn't have time to do much more than French plait my waist length, chocolate brown hair, and brush my teeth. Being Irish, my skin repelled any sort of tanning. I had skin as white as alabaster with a splash of dark freckles that dotted different sections of my face. I turned to the side and rolled my eyes. If I could change one thing about my body, it would be my arse. It was big, and more than a few times I had gotten crude comments about it. I didn't like that because it messed with my need to be ignored. I liked being practically invisible.
I mean, yeah, no one enjoys being catcalled, but she is still basically saying, ugh, I wish I didn't have this perfect bubble butt because it's just too damn sexy. Mentioning people's eye color over and over again is another trope of self-published books that Casey falls into. I don't know why it's so popular or why it annoys me so much, but here we are. Despite this, my sanity didn't take its first major hit until chapter 3, where despite her complaints and clearly stated requests not to be, 17-year-old Brona is chosen by her teacher to take part in the school's most popular fundraising attraction, the kissing booth. Look, I can't claim to intimately know Irish law or culture, but minors being forced against their will by adults to publicly make out with their schoolmates for money surely cannot be legal. I am begging you guys to tell me that this is an invention of L.A. Casey's mind. And just when I thought I couldn't get any more uncomfortable with this pseudo-prostitution, her first customers were 13-year-old boys. There is a description of the main character of this book having to kiss literal children over and over again. And they only charged €2 each. They rented out this teen girl's rosy lips to her entire school against her will for less than the price of a portion of fish and chips. I know I just finished synopsisizing a book that eroticized basically owning another human being, but it's just the age of the participants in this scenario made it one of the most unbearably awkward things I have ever read. Like, I'm not blind to the intended purpose of this chapter. It's clearly so Brona can complain about all the boys, including Dominic, choosing to kiss her over the other participants, despite how completely disinterested she is in being the center of attention, but my God, I was cringing so hard I think I strained a neck muscle. I felt like I was actually dying of cringe. I was going to be the first scientifically recognized occurrence of death by sheer uncomfortableness. And now, on to Dominic. This fucking guy. I think Casey was going for a enemies to lovers, love at first fight kind of thing, but Dominic is not a lovable jerk. He is an unstable, violent douchebag who adamantly believes he is entitled to anything, everything, and anyone he wants. And that is not a subtle character trait. It's on the cover of the bloody book. He continuously gropes, negs, threatens, and belittles Brona at every opportunity, and then just informs her that they're dating now and he has full ownership of her from now on. When and if she pushes back against this in any way, he flies into uncontrollable rages, starts calling her a slut, physically intimidates her, threatens violence, and intentionally spreads rumors about her sleeping with him around her school. Dominic somehow manages to be a complete incel while actually getting laid quite a lot, working his way through Brona's classmates while trying to get her to date him. Oh, but this open season can't go both ways. He attempts to grievously bodily harm any guy who so much as tries to talk to her, while continuing to verbally abuse and humiliate her in front of all her classmates. Frustratingly, he and Brona both subscribe to the idea that nothing short of penetrative sex counts as sexual assault, because they both vehemently deny that he's ever assaulted her, while he continues to grope, bite, and force kisses on her every other chapter. For her part, Brona is often confused because she genuinely hates his guts but is physically attracted to him, and conflates that with having romantic feelings that she's obligated to explore. I don't know where that comes from, but it's another thing that I've seen all over the romance genre. Unless you're some form of demisexual, it is entirely possible to feel arousal for someone you don't like. That doesn't mean you should date your abuser. I think what's really getting to me is this is one of those occasions where I can't tell how intentional any of this is on the part of the author. Everything from the blurb on the back of the book to the character dialogue suggests that Brona's biggest problem is that since she lost her parents at a young age, she's become antisocial and needs to start letting people in. This, to me, seems like a secondary concern to her being gaslit into a relationship with a violent nutjob. The final straw for me was when they officially got together. To set the scene, she goes on a date with someone she actually likes and is nice to her, but Dominic stalks them to McDonald's, attacks her date, injuring her in the process, insists on taking her to the hospital himself, then continues to molest her in the waiting room. While she's sitting there, cradling her broken bone, having to lie to the doctors about how it happened, and Dominic continues to smugly tell everyone he's her boyfriend, that is when she decides to give dating him a chance. And it was in this moment that I realized that even if Dominic had a complete 100% redemption arc for the rest of the book, it was just too late for me. People like him don't deserve fixing. They deserve to be in prison while their victims flourish without them. I did skip forward to the last chapter. They were, unfortunately, still together. The impression I got was someone even worse than Dominic had turned up and he had to save her from him. Again, I know it might seem a little insane that I'm so much more distressed over this book than the one that involved human trafficking, but the difference is that was so dark it was unrealistically surreal. This is a very accurate portrayal of how some people end up in abusive relationships, and as far as I can see, it is being played off as semi-romantic. I am willing to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, somehow, and I do not personally know how, but I'm not omniscient, L.A. Casey was building to a huge turnaround in the second half. If that is the case, please consider me thoroughly shamed, exposed as a hack, humbled and apologetic as fuck, but gods have mercy on me, I do not have the strength to find out for myself. So, going off my regretfully but inescapably incomplete experience, Slater family Dominic gets 0 Dominics for story. Minus 2,000 Dominics for these super awkward sexual moments that occurred between a girl who is barely turned 18 and her abuser, and minus 2,864,210 Dominics for the Dominic who has brought shame upon the name. Thank you, Bright Sellers. You were here for me in my hour of need. And last but not least, we just covered the least, Dominic, a new Carnegie android romance published in 2022, written by Roxy McLean, a sci-fi, fantasy, and paranormal romance author from the American Southwest. Yep, this Dominic is a literal sex robot. Miss McLean, you have no idea how much I needed this as a palate cleanser. Book 3 of 5 in a series set in a rather unusual future, in which humanity has somehow perfected fully self-aware artificial intelligence and the design of almost perfectly human-looking android bodies, while seemingly not advancing any other technology in any way. Amusingly, I clocked a fair amount of Star Wars coined terminology in this book, even though those movies are never referenced, things like droid and restraining bolt. As is quite often the way in these science fiction scenarios, humanity has become super racist towards androids, restricting their rights and buying and selling them as property, despite them being very clearly sapient and sentient. I gotta say, props to McLean for the world building. Even in this quite short book, I got the impression of a much bigger story going on around the main characters. Chapters often begin with news updates that seem to suggest continually rising tensions between anti-android movements, pro-android rights groups, and corporations and governments beginning to utilize them for more and more jobs. If these books weren't primarily about getting some synthetic cock, I would be genuinely worried that it's building up towards World War III, like an extremely sexual prequel to The Matrix. A focal point of the debate appears to be based around a social media influencer who married and adopted kids with her android, and now does family and political vlogs with him on the regular. One has to assume this was the protagonist of one of the earlier books in the series. There seems to be an amusing push to discourage being tempted into sin with your android by encouraging people to buy models that are of a gender that you're not attracted to. I gotta say though, unless I missed it or it was explained in an earlier book, I couldn't find a reason why androids designed exclusively for various hard labor or dangerous tasks were built with genders or sexual organs in the first place. I mean, you'd think it would be a lot of extra work to design and install fully functioning genitalia and digitally programmed libidos. But built with them they were, and Dominic the android gets a lot of use out of his. He is in fact a bit of a manslut, though thankfully he doesn't have consent issues like a lot of the other Dominics. Weirdly, he appears to have either been programmed with or developed the personality and cadence of someone from the deep south of the United States. He's a bit of a hillbilly sex droid. He started life as construction equipment before getting damaged and refurbished, and now works doing freelance odd jobs with an independent android rental company that's owned by a more bionic, respectful person than average. The story is split between him and Madison, a young lady trying her best to care for her dying father. They're struggling to get the healthcare they need because it may be the future, but it's still America. So they hire Dominic as a live-in nurse, as he can just download the necessary medical knowledge straight into his brain from the interweb. The mandatory butting of heads between the leads before they fuck was thankfully kept to a minimum this time, and the conflict at the end was more interesting than most because it revolved around trying to stop the police from shutting Dominic down permanently for injuring a human while defending Madison. I gotta say, Robo-Dominic was the least annoying of all the Dominics, but he is not perfect. He's just enough of the old-fashioned romantic type to rub me up the wrong way here and there. For example, he adamantly won't let Madison pay for stuff or drive herself, and is kind of intense about stuff like opening doors for her. It's one of those occasions where chivalry bleeds over into being straight up condescending and very controlling.
You can carry that cute purse around all you want, but you're not paying for your own drinks when I'm around. Stunned, she stares up at me, blinking furiously. Then, the gorgeous little pistol who had me seems to remember she's loaded with attitude. I don't need a man to buy anything for me. I know. I glance at the cashier who's holding back laughter. I wasn't asking. She opens the door, but I catch it, stopping her. No, 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 no. She turns to me in confusion and frowns, opening her mouth as though she means to argue. I hold up a hand. You're gonna let me open the door for you and you're not gonna say shit about it.
I have to admit, this also wasn't the most creative book I've ever read regarding exploring how an android's mind might differ from a human's. Dominic's internal monologue is basically indistinguishable from any of the human characters, aside from the occasional reference to his processor or gratification drive. Him being a ribbit does lead to another trope usurpation though. When Madison walks in on him with a half-naked woman draped on top of him, the breakup based on a misunderstanding is averted when Dominic simply emails her a copy of his recent memory files and she can see that the young lady threw herself on him without his encouragement. Partway into the story, it's revealed that this Dominic is also a professional fighter, though in a recently legalized robot combat league. It turns out he's pretty famous in it too, with a significant fan base, which makes me wonder why he's doing menial tasks on the side. It's like finding out that John Cena works as a nurse whenever he's not performing. So I actually found the story of a girl and her sex machine finding love while dealing with the hardship of losing a relative and a world that doesn't consider him a person surprisingly engaging. So I'm going to give it a whopping 8 out of 10 Dominics. While these sex scenes avoided making me uncomfortable, they were also kind of dull to be honest, so I'm going to give them a middle of the road 5 Dominics. And as I said, Rock'em Sock'em Robot with a big dick Dominic was my favourite of the bunch, so 7 Dominics. I won't hold him being a hillbilly against him, but he loses a few points for being boringly human-like and for being all weird about Madison driving and opening doors for herself. Alas, I had to call it at 4 Dominics for this video because of time constraints, but there is still a frankly shocking amount of erotic novels called Dominic out there, including the one that is actually about wizards that I said I'd talk about frickin' years ago, but forgot about until it was too late to be included in this episode. So, if you would like this to become a recurring theme, leave your boy a comment. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. Like, share, subscribe, and I hope I'll see you next time. Much love and appreciation to my patrons of honor, April Mack, Shelby Holtz, and Curtis Charles Jr. And a big thank you to this video's editor, Sophia Ricciardi. Links to her work in the video description. You know, it's funny, this says liberated from alcohol instead of being just saying alcohol-free. Like it fought a revolution against alcohol. I've decided to judge this Dominic toxic masculinity. Bleh. Shishter. I swear there's no alcohol in this. I'm not slurring because I'm drunk. Where's my wine gone?